Well, I manage the office in Delaware for a company called Applied Energy Group, and we're a consulting firm. And what we do is we work mainly with electric and gas utilities to design and manage energy efficiency and renewable energy programs for those clients. My background is in engineering. I graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering way back in 1980 at the University of Delaware, and I started even before that. I was working with the Navy in propulsion systems, and that led me into mechanical engineering, which eventually led to a job working for an electric utility. So that's my job background. That's not an easy question to answer, because we've been making predictions about that for a very long time. I mean, for decades people have been saying that, you know, the transition is right around the corner. There's kind of an old joke in the solar industry that if you want to know when solar is going to be cost effective, the answer is always 5 years. And it's been that way for the last 40 years. So the answer to that is probably not in my lifetime, and maybe never fully dependent on renewables. Really, the question you're asking is about making a transition, and we've been through these transitions before. In fact, if you look back a couple hundred years ago, and for centuries before that, we really were fully dependent on renewable energy then, right? Wind, solar, wood, all those renewable resources. That's primarily what we used for our energy sources going back a couple hundred years before the Industrial Revolution. So really the transition that was made then was to non-renewable fuels and energy sources, and now we're talking about flipping that on its head and transitioning away from those non-renewable energy resources and going to renewable energy resources. So it's not the first time we've been through this. The thing that makes the reason that happened in the past was for economics, and because we were also industrializing. The reason that it's happening, that it will happen in the future, is maybe a little bit more urgent now because of environmental concerns, particularly climate change. So it's really hard to say when we'll see a significant amount of renewables coming into the energy mix. It's happening now with things like wind and solar, where they're growing rapidly, but they're starting from a very small base. So it's going to be decades, maybe not in my lifetime, and maybe not ever, that we'll be 100% dependent on renewables. That's another hard question to answer, but the short answer is it depends on what renewables you're talking about. If you tried to put renewables into categories, there are the ones that most people think of. There's solar, there's wind, there's hydropower, which we've had for a long, long time. That's been around for centuries. And then there are other things like biofuels and waste fuels and things like that that today, right now, are cost effective, so there really wouldn't be any impact by using those. But they're available in relatively small quantities, so they're not going to fill a big portion of our energy needs. Hydro, in the case of hydro, for example, in this country, we've tapped all of our large hydro resources, so it's not like there's a lot more to develop there. The two biggest ones are solar and wind is more and more cost effective already. In fact, it's competitive in many parts of the country against conventional resources. Solar is still a little further out, and it's more expensive. There are places where solar is economically viable now. Usually it's in smaller off-grid power systems for small sites, small users. The effect on the economy is really going to depend a great deal on how fast we try to do it and how we do it. So my personal opinion is that, and I think most economists would agree with this, is that probably the most efficient way to do this and the least disruptive way to do it to the economy is through a carbon tax. Because what a tax does is it discourages what you don't want and encourages what you do want. So if you think about it, by applying a carbon tax, you'd be reducing the cost of renewables in comparison to conventional fossil fuels, and so you get more renewables and less fossil fuels, which would be the goal. And at the same time, you're creating jobs in new technologies and new resources. But there are always winners and losers when you do that kind of thing. And you know, the first thing to remember is that taxes are pretty controversial right now, so I don't see something like this happening quickly or very soon in the U.S. There are other countries that are doing this now with carbon taxes, and they've seen some pretty good results from it. The other thing to remember is that we, in the United States, very heavily subsidize conventional fuels, fossil fuels in particular. So that means that if you're going to apply something like a carbon tax and you try to level the playing field between renewables and conventional fuels, those subsidies are going to have to go away. Now that means that those businesses that are dependent on receiving the subsidies are going to be hurt, and so there may also be some jobs lost on the more conventional side of the energy resources. What we're doing with making renewables more cost effective is kind of the same thing that we've always done. The government's always played a pretty heavy role in energy resources in this country, and the way that we've done that is along a couple of different paths, but we've always put these things into our tax system to encourage or discourage certain things. And so there are things like tax credits and other tax advantages that we put into energy, different energy resources and technologies. Sometimes we apply incentives of different kinds. You know, provide money to directly encourage adoption of certain technologies and resources, and then finally we use laws and regulations to do that. So a good example would be with oil. We've had for many years something called a depletion allowance, and that's basically a tax credit that producers get by just producing oil. So they get a benefit from the tax system for that. We also provide, tax motor fuels to encourage highway construction, and that also encourages more use of motor fuels, diesel fuel and gasoline. So we've had those kinds of things around for a long, long time. We're doing similar things with renewables. So we have tax credits for wind and solar. We've got significant tax credits, although I think it's just recently changed with one of the more recent agriculture bills. We had pretty significant tax credits for corn-based ethanol. And not only tax credits, but at the same time, we outlawed a gasoline additive called MTBE. It was a problem with groundwater contamination. So those two things encourage the use of ethanol, because ethanol could be used as a substitute for that. So that encouraged the use of ethanol in gasoline. So we've done all these kinds of things using laws, regulations, tax credits, incentives, things like that to encourage those kinds of, to encourage what we want to encourage. And we're doing that with renewables now. That's kind of a cumbersome system though, because it depends a whole lot on politics. Well, natural gas is becoming more and more significant, especially in electricity generation. As little as 2 years ago, about 55% of our electricity was generated from coal. And since we've started to get more and more gas from shale, you've heard about fracking and that sort of thing, I'm guessing. What's happened is there's been a big shift away from coal and towards natural gas. So now about 35% of our electricity is generated from coal, and what made up that difference was natural gas, because it's easy to switch between the two for generating electricity. Some other areas that I think are going to develop in the near future are using natural gas for transportation fuels, because you can use natural gas in the same kinds of engines that are in common use in cars, for example. The biggest barrier to that will be refueling, because natural gas refueling stations are pretty rare, but that could happen fairly quickly in the next decade or so. So I think natural gas will continue to play an important role in electricity, and it may play a more important role in transportation. The two biggest problems that I see are cost and availability. And that depends on the resource that you're talking about. So the more cost-effective resources are the ones that are probably least available, like waste fuels and biofuels. The most available resources are wind and solar, but the technologies to convert them to electricity are more expensive, particularly for solar. So cost is one factor, and then availability is the other factor. There's plenty of solar and wind out there, but it's expensive to convert. The fuels that are easy to use and relatively inexpensive are not that available. There's not as much of it available. Yeah, I think fuel cells have potentially a significant role to play in transportation because they're small, and with some of the newer technologies, they're lighter weight, they're very clean. And there's been a lot of work done on using fuel cells in transportation, automobiles and buses and things like that. In fact, if you go to the University of Delaware, they have a fuel cell bus that they run around the campus, you might have seen. As far as generating electricity, that's a little unclear to me, because it's the primary fuel for fuel cells right now is natural gas. And fuel cells are designed to convert hydrogen into electricity, and the source of hydrogen for fuel cells now is really natural gas. There are other technologies, more conventional technologies, that are just as efficient as fuel cells for generating electricity, and they cost a lot less. So it's going to be much harder for fuel cells to get into generating electricity, but I think there is probably more of a place for them in transportation in the near future. Yeah, in fact, you could probably say that that transition is happening now with what I mentioned about electricity generation, and much of it switching over, starting to switch over to natural gas. So natural gas has always been predicted to play an important role in that transition between where we are now and to renewables. One of the most important things that I see about that is you have to have something to transition to. So if you're going to use it as a bridge fuel, you have to go somewhere with that. And if you're heading towards renewables, that means that we have to continue developing renewables. We have to continue bringing the costs down, making them more available in order to make that transition. The other thing is that, and this often gets lost in the discussion about how to supply energy, is on the demand side. So as part of that bridge, there's another resource that ought to be part of the discussion, and that's energy efficiency, because all resources, whether they're renewable or non-renewable, have pros and cons, and there are trade-offs, environmental trade-offs, economic trade-offs. But energy efficiency is one of the things that really doesn't have any bad side effects, because even today it's cost-effective. There are no negative environmental consequences to it, and it's readily available. And so that's as important as natural gas, I think, when you're talking about that bridge over to renewables. And it also sets the stage for using the renewables that you're going to develop more efficiently, which makes them go further. I don't see it as either or. And I mentioned before that governments always played a big role in energy. So I think that The short answer is yes, there's a place for government in this. And the two questions that I think are really important is what role should they play, and how fast are you going to try to make the transition? If the goal is to try to make the transition as fast as possible for environmental reasons, let's say, I mentioned the carbon tax. That one of the reasons I like the carbon tax is because it's a very simple way of sending the signal to the marketplace that you want more renewables and less fossil fuels. And when you set it up that way, what that means is now the market takes over the rest of it and starts to allocate which resources and which efficiency you should use in any given situation, rather than trying to do it more from the top down by trying to say, well, we're going to pick solar here and we're going to pick wind there and certain percentages of each. That's when things get kind of messy. So I think there is definitely a role for government. There's still a role for incentives and for some of these other special treatment of certain renewables and technologies, because that's the way we've historically helped to develop technology in this country. So I don't think it's either or. I think there's a role for both.